In this video, I will explain how to use the git stash command using live animations of what's happening under the hood while I'm issuing the actual commands. I guarantee this will help you deeply understand Stash just as it's helped the hundreds of thousands of other folks who have watched my other Git videos. So let's get started. Git Stash allows you to save a draft of your in-progress changes and revert your working directory back to a clean slate. So in other words, Stash takes any uncommitted changes on your working directory, whether they be staged or unstaged changes, and puts them aside while reverting your working directory back to match your head commit. Now, Stash is typically used when you want to temporarily put files aside to do a remote pull or a merge rebase on a branch. Now, Git also stores stashes in a stack-like structure, and you can store multiple stashes at a time, each with their own individual files. In addition, stashes can simply be kind of popped off the stack, but they can be reincarnated in more complex ways as well, including as their own branches. And I'm going to go over all of those in just a bit. And then lastly, when you're applying stashes, there is a chance that you're going to have merge conflicts, and I'll also go over how to fix those, as well as a nice quick workaround if you don't want to have to deal with the stash merge conflict right away. So let's say I'm working on a web application. I have a repository checked out that looks like this. And as you can see, it's pretty simple. I just have one branch, which is my mainline branch. And on that branch, there are just 2 commits. But if I show my in-progress changes, you can see that I've created or modified multiple files related to a navigational bar component that I'm working on right now. And then if I run git status, you can see those files right there. And you can see that index.html has been modified, and I can show quickly what has been changed. As you can see, I've added a navigational bar include in index.html. Now, the navigation component isn't quite finished, but if I wanted to save a draft on work and come back to it later, I can use git stash for this. Now, before I do that, I want to point out one thing. If I run git status, you can see that nav.css and nav.html are new files that I've created since that last commit on mainline, which means they're untracked by Git. By default, if I run git stash, it's only going to stash files that are tracked by Git. So for right now, I'm going to run git add dot. And what that's going to do if I run git status again is it's going to track all the files in my working directory so that when I run a git stash, and here's the git stashing part. If I run a git stash, it's now going to take all 3 of those files, round them up, and put them aside for me. So what does setting aside actually mean? Well, Git maintains a stack of all of your stash entries, and we can view that by typing git stash list. Now, as you can see, I only have one stash entry, which is the one I just created. If I wanted to see what was in that, I can run git stash show. And as you can see, that stash entry contains all 3 of those files that were previously on my working directory. And now, as you can see, if I run git status now, my branch is clean and there is nothing new to report. Great, so now my files are safely stored away for later, and I can start working on other things. But if I wanted to pull those changes back out again and start working on the navigational component and pick up where I left off, all I do is run git stash pop, and what this will do is it will tell Git to take all those files from my stash, apply them right on top of that head commit once again, and remove that stash entry. You can see right at the bottom of this status on the screen, you can see that it dropped refs-stash 0. That was the absolute simplest stashing workflow, but you want to know a few more critical things about Stash. First off, you can have multiple different stashes and apply them in interesting ways, and this is where Stash becomes really powerful. So let's get to those right now. So I have those in progress changes right here from earlier. Now, if I want to stash those changes and actually name the stash entry, I can run git stash -m. So if I want to say this, so if I run git status, you can see I have those changes from earlier. Now, if I run git stash -m and create a name for this, I'm going to say navbar v1 enter. You can see that a stash entry is created just as before, but if I run git stash list, now you can see that my stash entry actually has a readable name. Now, this is really useful when you start creating multiple stash entries. Now, with those navigational bar changes stashed away, I can start working on something else. So say I'm going to write a script, and of course I can stash away that script in its own stash. And once again, if I run git stash list, now you can see I have 2 stashes that are specified by their index numbers 0 and 1. Now, as we learned, Git stores stash entries in a stack, which means that the last commit to go onto the stack, in this case, the script stash, is now going to take index 0. So if I run git stash pop, it's going to pull that off the list. Now, you can manually designate which commit you want to apply by running git stash pop dash dash index. So if I wanted to pull off the navbar component instead, I would just specify index 1. So now if I hit enter and run this, you can see that it pulled my navigational bar changes off that stash list. And if I run git stash list here, you can see that now that stash entry is gone. Now, if we roll back and put that navigational bar stash back in the stash entry list like before, there's a really cool thing that Git can do when applying stashes. Now, if you run git stash branch, you can actually specify a branch name and reincarnate any of those stash changes onto their own branch. So if I run git stash branch, and I'm going to name that branch nav because I'm going to pull out those navigational bar components and specify the index here, hit enter, you can see that I've now created a new branch called nav, and then all of those stashed navigational bar components are now reincarnated on top of that new nav branch. But if I clear the screen and run git log, you can see that I'm now on the nav branch. And if I run git status, just like before, you can see that I now have those 3 files reincarnated right here. Now, one quick thing before we get back to merge conflicts is that you can always drop a stash entry by running git stash drop and then specifying the stash name. Now, you can also drop and clear your entire stash stack by running git stash clear. And as you can see, if I run git stash list now, you can see that that script stash is now gone. Speaking of merge conflicts, if the working directory introduced changes that conflict with any of the stash files, when you run git stash pop and it tries to apply those stash changes on top of new work, it could fail with merge conflicts that may look something like this. Now, to learn how to fix those, check out my follow-up video here. Now, that video gets right to the point, but I separated it out from this one just in case folks were searching for information about git stash merge conflicts. I didn't want to have them sit through this entire video just to get to that information. Now, if you want a written reference for anything that we talked about in this video, check out the blog article I linked below. But I think that's all I have for you today. Subscribe for more Git videos, and I will see you later.